Everyone knows Apple. In fact, odds are at least halfway decent that you are watching this video on an Apple device like an iPhone or an iPad. The company changed computers, personal technology, and the whole world, becoming leaders in innovation and entrepreneurship. Its founders, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, have become business and technological legends, and the story of Apple has become a massive part of the American ethos. But what if it wasn't Apple? What if it was a very different company, Xerox, that changed the face of the modern technological world? It almost was. In fact, Xerox had much of Apple's classic technology in the late 1970s, but 2 visits by Apple executives to a Xerox research facility ultimately changed the face of the modern world. If you've ever made a copy, you've heard of Xerox. The company is a worldwide conglomerate founded in 1916 as a manufacturer of photography-related equipment. In 1938, it invented the first photocopy machine, which began to be manufactured commercially in 1959 and changed the face of the modern office. Xerox would expand into additional technological spaces, and by the 1970s, it began to produce mainframe computers. That is where this story intersects with Apple. In the 1970s, Apple was a shell of what they are today. The company was founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. By 1979, the company had produced multiple computers, including the Apple I and the Apple II. Apple's early computers contained multiple then-revolutionary products. This included color graphics, open architecture, and alternative forms of storage that were much easier to operate for the average consumer. Now, even in the 1960s and 70s, Xerox recognized that they could not just rest on their laurels. They knew that one day, paper would not be as prevalent in the modern office, and they didn't want to see themselves left behind. It's actually really impressive that the company recognized this even back in the 60s. As such, they created the PARC Computer Science Laboratory. PARC, which stood for Palo Alto Research Center after the location of the center, had a simple and broad charge: create the office of the future. PARC opened in 1969. Its location across the country from Xerox Rochester headquarters gave them the ability to recruit West Coast personnel and infuse the company with a West Coast sensibility that simply wasn't seen in the more rigid East Coast. PARC was managed by Robert Taylor. Taylor had previously worked at ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency, and used his connections in the scientific community to pull some of the best and brightest minds. As the manager of PARC, Taylor encouraged an environment that was open to innovation. According to John Warnock, a PARC researcher who would later found Adobe Systems, the atmosphere was electric. There was total intellectual freedom. There was no conventional wisdom. Almost every idea was up for challenge and got challenged regularly. By 1979, PARC had pioneered a slew of new inventions. One such example was the Alto computer. Now, to understand the Alto, you have to understand what computers at the time were like. In short, they were nothing like they are today. For one thing, there was no mouse. There were no icons. Most computers didn't have colors. Most had a simple text interface that could allow you to run commands if you knew what to type. Word processors, Excel spreadsheets, email communication were all years and years away. The Alto computer changed all of that. The Alto was Xerox's first personal computer. It was revolutionary for many reasons. First, it was the very first computer with a graphical user interface. This meant that graphics represented functions that could be accessed by a keyboard or an early 3-button mouse. It also contained some astonishingly advanced programs, including an early email client and a vector graphics editor. Perhaps most importantly, the Alto used a what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG typesetting tool. This meant that documents and other programs could be edited on the computer, then printed as they were displayed. We don't even think about this, but again, for the time, it was considered a massive deal. The Alto's popularity was limited. It cost tens of thousands of dollars, which obviously limited the ability of the system to be purchased or sold. By the late 1970s, there were about 1,000 in use in Xerox offices, with another 500 used in universities across the country. Meanwhile, Apple was doing more than just inventing really neat and innovative computers. Revenue had practically doubled every 4 months that Apple was in existence, starting in 1976. Private funding was flush, and the company was starting to look at going public in the stock market, a move that was bound to make millionaires out of Jobs, Wozniak, and many other Apple employees. However, the company, always innovating even then, was at a crossroads. Its computers were new, different, and selling well, But they weren't the only personal computers on the market. Competitors included the Intel 8088 and the TI 99-4. That same year, color monitors, color printers, and even the Intellivision home gaming console came out. In other words, the personal computer space was getting crowded. Apple needed to build a competitive advantage. Now, Apple and Xerox already had some ties. Many Apple employees either knew of PARC, had heard of their products, or had worked there previously. This included Jeff Raskin, who worked at Apple as the manager of publications. The natural ties that bound both of these organizations would lead to a fateful decision in 1979. At the time, Apple hadn't yet gone public, meaning it hadn't yet opened itself for stock investments. That would happen about a year later, so it was obviously moving in that direction. Xerox understood Apple's potential, so a deal was struck. Xerox's board made a pre-IPO investment in Apple. Specifically, they were given the option to buy up to 100,000 shares of Apple stock at $10 a share. The shares would ultimately debut at $22, so this was a really good deal for Xerox. In exchange, Apple got to explore PARC and get a look under the hood at the technological investments that Xerox was making. This meant days of access to PARC. Many Apple executives, including Jeff Raskin and ultimately Steve Jobs, attended these two visits. Raskin was widely involved in developing many of Apple's original computers and systems. So was Bill Atkinson, a computer engineer for Apple who also attended the PARC visits. So, what did Apple execs see? Enough to convince them about the future of technology and computing, and fundamentally change the direction of Apple's products. Now, like I said, there were two visits to PARC. During these visits, Steve Jobs found three pieces of technology that he realized would fundamentally alter the computing space. The first was object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming was a then revolutionary method of computer programming. Specifically, it was a programming model that organizes programming languages around data and code, not logic and functions. That method limited flexibility, reusability, and troubleshooting. Object-oriented programming was leaps and bounds ahead of other forms of programming and could fundamentally change computer architecture. Second, Jobs discovered networked computer systems. 100 Alto computers were networked together at the PARC, giving these computers the ability to easily share information and send early versions of email. It was quickly apparent to Jobs that networked computers would make a massive difference in the office. And third, and most important, the graphical user interface. In a 1995 interview, Jobs would later describe himself as being, quote, blinded by the GUI. The graphical user interface had the ability to take personal computers and actually make them personal. It could allow for dramatically increased efficiency and customization. It would also enable regular people, not just programmers, to use computers. The graphical user interface would create icons that allowed for the average user to execute computer functions. This simplified the process of using the computer. It brought it down from the range of extreme intellectuals with computer programming expertise to something that the average business person could do. This was revolutionary. Now, let's be clear, Apple already had many of these technologies. They were working in a similar direction as Xerox with their Apple I and Apple II, and were trying to figure out where to go next. It's also worth noting that the Alto wasn't a trade secret. According to one estimate, 2,000 people had seen the Alto computer by 1975, 4 years before Apple even got there. Apple didn't steal anything from Xerox. The company showed Apple the technology. However, Apple didn't have the specific answers yet. In a 1995 interview, Jobs would say that Xerox had the, quote, germ of an idea, but it didn't have the specific tools to actually make the GUI work for the average consumer. What the Xerox visits ultimately proved to Jobs was that the graphical user interface was the way to go. That resulted in the Lisa, which would forever change computing. The Lisa, which Apple first sold in 1983, was leaps and bounds ahead of other personal computers at the time. It was one of the first personal computers with a truly graphical user interface. It contained a 5 megabyte hard drive, and it had a floppy disk drive. Only 10,000 were sold in the first 2 years, but the Lisa paved the way for the Macintosh, a more polished and more affordable version of the Lisa. The original Macintosh ultimately sold 70,000 units in 3 years, and continued Apple's journey to massive commercial success in the personal computing market. Xerox never attempted to sell the Alto commercially. It had some success in selling commercial-based computer systems, but it never attempted to compete with Apple in the PC world. They lost that advantage and that opportunity. Now, don't cry too hard for Xerox or for PARC. Xerox remains a major global corporation in the office systems field. In 2021, Xerox had revenues of slightly more than $7 billion and employs more than 23,000 people. PARC would go on to be responsible for many additional inventions, including laser printers, optical storage, fiber optics, and more. It actually still operates today, although it's been its own company since 2002 and operates independently from Xerox. Now, for all of Xerox's success, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what Apple has been able to do. Apple's 2002 revenue numbers were more than $394 billion. It employs more than 164,000 people across the globe, and as of this recording, it is the most valuable company in the world. I guess that this proves a fundamental point about technology, innovation, and success. Success isn't just about creating the best products. It's about recognizing their potential. Jobs recognized what Xerox had, even if Xerox themselves didn't. When talking about the graphical user interface, Jobs said, "I thought it was the best thing I had ever seen in my life. Within 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this." Compared to everything else that was available at the time, Jobs was right. The graphical user interface, along with object-oriented programming and network computers, would change the face of computers, the modern office, and how humans talk to each other. Jobs and Apple saw it. Xerox didn't. And that made all the difference. And that is it for this business edition of Almost Something. If you liked what you saw, most important of all, please hit that subscribe button. If you want to leave a comment or hit the like button, that is always appreciated. But we want to know that you like what we're producing, so hit that subscribe button and we will continue to crank out more high-quality content. Thank you, friends. I continue to absolutely love producing these videos for you, and I hope you like watching them as much as I love making them. Have a wonderful day out there, and don't let there be any almost in your life.